From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. This is the day GOP candidate Bob Stefanowski had confirmed to join us as part of our series of interviews with all 5 Connecticut gubernatorial candidates. It's not just me asking the questions. We've been taking listener calls and reading questions posed from viewers watching us on Facebook Live. On Tuesday, Stefanowski's campaign canceled his Where We Live appearance, but we know there are still plenty of questions potential voters have for him before Election Day. So today, Where We Live, we've assembled a team of reporters and political analysts to walk us through Stefanowski's campaign messaging and his strategy. Is his campaign's rallying cry to eliminate Connecticut's income tax for real? And how will state government operate without that income tax revenue, a whopping $10 billion a year? And realistically, what spending can Stefanowski actually cut from Connecticut's budget? There's a reason Connecticut Mirror reporter Keith Phaneuf is known as the budget guru. We'll ask him those questions coming up. We'll also take your questions on air. Which gubernatorial candidate are you leaning towards November 6th? Here's the number, 860-275-7266. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. First, Bob Stefanowski started campaigning long before the Republican primary. He's cast himself as a political outsider and the kind of guy who can get Connecticut out of its fiscal straits by highlighting his business career as a former corporate executive. His non-traditional campaign included ignoring the state Republican Party convention, and despite that, he won that GOP primary. Is his strategy enough to win enough votes outside the GOP base? Can he attract unaffiliated voters, the largest group of voters in Connecticut? My first guest wrote about Bob Stefanowski's latest strategy, and that includes ignoring most press. Neil Victor is political reporter at the Hartford Courant. Neil, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Lucy. Thanks for having me on.
Also joining us by phone is John Dankosky, who's moderated several debates, some when Stefanowski appeared, some where he did not. He's also host of WNPR's The Wheelhouse and executive editor of the New England News Collaborative. John, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much, Lucy.
So, Neil, I'll start with you. Let's talk about what you reported on, and that's this pattern of limited public appearances. Tell us exactly who has he been shutting out?
Well, up until last week, Bob Stefanowski had really only released his campaign schedule publicly 4 times since winning the GOP primary in mid-August, and that's a very unconventional campaign that he's running. With Ned Lamont, we've seen a TikTok of events, press conferences, daily media availability, and Stefanowski has limited his exposure. He does give interviews, but there are certain media outlets that he's bypassing, and he did some of this in the primary, and it was effective for him. So I think the kind of mindset for his brain trust is, why change what's been working for us? And, he does a lot. He's been fundraising a lot. He says he's spent probably 50% of his time since the primary at fundraisers, and all those events are closed to the media. He and the other events that he's done have been party events, things that are pre-ticketed, where you know what kind of audience that you're getting. He has gone to fairs and other public events, but he's not telling the media about it. There were 2 kind of striking examples of his media kind of blackout strategy. He had campaigned a couple of weeks ago in New Britain with Aaron Stewart, the mayor there, who is young and gets the whole social media thing, comes from a blue-collar background and city. You would think that would be the kind of thing that you would want the media to tag along. They told the local newspaper, but they didn't tell anybody else in the political press corps. And then about 10 days later, he was with Mark Boughton, the runner-up from the primary, who he beat. the mayor of Danbury, at Boehringer Ingelheim Pharmaceuticals in Danbury, and not a peep to the media ahead of time about this. And afterwards, Stefanowski explained it that they have a strict no media policy at this pharmaceutical company. But it is definitely a departure from the traditional campaigns that we've seen in Connecticut.
I should say, with Bob Stefanowski's campaign canceling on Where We Live today, in the statement they provided, they mentioned that he's been doing a lot of radio, and they now want to get, quote, Bob on the road. We should mention that Bob Stefanowski was actually on the air with a radio station this morning. It's the Lee Elsey Show. This is in Southeast Connecticut, and we have a clip from that show.
I want to remind everybody, we have a few signs left, Bob Stefanowski signs, so if you want to come and pick them up, they are here, certainly here at the studio.
I think we may be going through. We're doing a bus tour coming up. I'm going to be on the road for 10 days. We got a Bob for Governor bus. We're going to be staying nights at Holiday Inns, and, we're going to get out crisscross the state.
With his cancellation, John, there was some on social media that said maybe WNPR should be more fair and balanced. I'm proud to say we don't hand out campaign signs to our listeners when a candidate comes on.
It's interesting, Lucy. I heard about this morning, and Lee Elsey is a conservative talk show host, and he's been going on with other conservative talk show hosts inside and outside the state of Connecticut. And I think it's part of a larger strategy that's not just about what Neil is discussing, about shutting out the traditional news media, but it's also about really appealing to a very specific base. Now, when you hear a Lee Elsey talk about how he wants to hand out Bob Stefanowski signs, you understand that probably it's not only someone who's going to appeal to the base, but also someone who's not going to give the candidate a whole lot of very difficult questions. And if this is part of the strategy, perhaps for Stefanowski, it's working. He's drawn close to Ned Lamont in this most recent poll that we've seen this past week. And he's in the 30s as far as approval amongst Connecticut voters right now, understanding that any poll is just a snapshot. But, if all he needs to get is somewhere in the 35 to 38% range, and he can beat Ned Lamont, and that's by energizing a very strict base of voters, well, then that's still a win. And so he may be taking a little bit of the playbook of Donald Trump and others from the Republican Party in the last couple of years and saying, we don't need a media that's going to ask us tough questions. We don't need pesky reporters bothering us for details.
I wanted to pick up also on what you and Neil are saying. We have a reporter, David DeRoche, who's been trying to cover the candidates more closely. He indicated that he had called Stefanowski's campaign to find out if Mr. Stefanowski would be appearing in studio on that Southeastern Connecticut radio show or by phone. He was told by the campaign spokesperson by phone. Instead, he showed up in person. Again, is this part of the strategy, Neil, to avoid, as John mentioned, pesky reporters showing up to ask you questions?
Sure, and even kind of telegraphing where you're going to be. I mean, I think that Stefanowski's handlers, Chris LaCivita, who has worked previously on Linda McMahon's campaign. McMahon was very tightly controlled, especially in 2012 when she faced Chris Murphy for the U.S. Senate. One need look only to 2014 and see, Tom Foley had put out his schedule ahead of time, went to a mill that was closing in Sprague in the southeastern corner of Connecticut and was kind of using that to highlight how bad the economy in Connecticut is under Democrats and Governor Malloy, and lo and behold, the Democrats get the schedule, and Kathy Austin, the state senator, who was also the first selectman of Sprague, shows up, confronts Foley, and asks him about his private equity venture capital firm closing a textile mill in Georgia. And he was ill-prepared to deal with her confronting him. And you have video of him looking like deer in headlights. And that was kind of doomed him. So I think that the people who are advising Stefanowski have seen these kind of things from the past and just kind of say, okay, well, we're going to limit your exposure.
This is Where We Live. On the phone with us, Neil Victor, political reporter at the Hartford Courant, and John Dankosky, host of WNPR's The Wheelhouse. John, as I mentioned earlier, you've moderated several debates before the primary and then also in the general election just last week. So really, the public to be able to hear where Bob stands on issues, it's been in these debates, and has it been adequate to hear what he's talking about in terms of if he's elected, this is what he's going to do for the state of Connecticut?
We mentioned this on the Wheelhouse yesterday, Lucy, and it's fascinating. If you get a chance to go read the story by Mark Pazniokis in the Connecticut Mirror about this issue in which he tracked down Stefanowski, did get to spend some time with him and some of his handlers. And when asked tough questions about the details of his income tax plan, which I'm sure you'll be talking about later on in this program, he and his support staff said, well, look, 30 seconds at a time during a TV ad or 30 seconds at a time during a debate isn't enough time to fully explain the complexity of what he's trying to do. And that is indeed true. But Bob Stefanowski hasn't taken part in as many debates as others who've taken part in this political campaign season. As Neil well knows, he didn't appear for all of the forums that Republicans took part in before the primary. I did moderate one in which he was there, and a number of other very different candidates were there, but we didn't have very much time for any of them. He declined an invitation for the very first debate post-primary. Ned Lamont and Oz Griebel both sat down on stage in Fairfield, in part because they said they wanted to get their message out soon. He and his campaign staff said it was way too soon, the week of Labor Day, to be able to prepare for something as big as a first debate. And then, of course, he took part in this most recent debate that included all three candidates that was last week in Hartford. And I think that, as we heard, there were some back and forths between him and Ned Lamont and him and Oz Griebel. Oz Griebel taking the opportunity to say that neither Lamont nor Stefanowski could, in the time allotted, really explain how they were going to cut the income tax and how they're going to solve some of the fiscal problems for the state. So those appearances in the debates haven't necessarily done everything that Stefanowski or, frankly, Ned Lamont is trying to do.
You can join our conversation here on Where We Live. Here's the number, 860-275-7266. Kathy's calling from Madison, where Bob Stefanowski resides. Kathy, welcome to the show. What's your question?
Hi. Yeah, it's more just a comment that I'm really annoyed that he didn't show up to your show today, that he canceled at the last minute. And it just shows that he doesn't seem to be ready to answer tough questions. And I think if he wants to be a representative of, if he wants to represent us in the state, he needs to go to people who may not agree with him and be able to answer tough questions. And I think what happens is perhaps it's sort of like the Donald Trump thing, in that he is just a blank slate, and he's just Mr. Cut Taxes, and then whatever whatever a person opinion that they have, they can put that onto him because he's not there to agree or disagree.
Well, thank you, Kathy, for your call. Neil, we heard Bob again talking about this bus tour that he's going to be embarking on. Do you know if the media has been invited?
They said that they're going to release the schedule in the next day or two. It'll be interesting to see how they manage that. A couple of observations. I think that Stefanowski, in terms of pulling out of his appearance today, I would guess that the calculus on the part of his campaign is that they figure that a lot of listeners who of WNPR have already made up their minds, and that they want to go after the undecideds, and that people who typically listen to WNPR are very informed and probably know which way they're going to go on this. And another thing is that Stefanowski's campaign is even using this kind of tension with the media to fundraise. And there was a email exchange between one of the Stefanowski supporters and Dan Haar of Hearst, Connecticut Media, in which Dan Haar talked about kind of the lack of specifics from Stefanowski on his income tax repeal plan, and he used the term that it was a joke, and had suggested that people that were supporting Stefanowski were misinformed, and the Stefanowski people are kind of running with that and using that to try to fire up the base, to raise money, almost the way that Donald Trump used the whole basket of deplorables thing to his advantage.
Let me pick up on something you said, Neil. We got a Facebook comment from Tony the other day who wrote, Stefanowski wasted an opportunity because a lot of independents and undecided people I know listen to NPR and Where We Live. And John, this is something that you talked about the other day.
Yeah, I think that, what Neil said makes a lot of sense if you're going to view listeners of a public radio station or really residents of Connecticut in a certain way. But I've always viewed it entirely the opposite way. The people who have the most information are the people who really don't know, and they want to find more information. They are undecided. The largest block of voters by far in Connecticut is unaffiliated. And then there's a whole lot of Democrats, and then there's a smaller number of Republicans. What seems to be happening with the Stefanowski campaign, and this may very well be a very canny strategy, is we're just going to really appeal to people who are overwhelmingly going to vote for a Republican. Those polls are pretty clear. 90% of Republicans are going to vote for Bob Stefanowski. And if all of them turn out, and because Republicans vote in bigger numbers than Democrats tend to, many of his voters might be older. They will tend to vote in midterm elections more so than younger voters. You will have enough turnout amongst Republicans and some currently undecided or unaffiliated voters to be able to turn the tide. But I just always felt, and I don't know how Neil feels about this, that there's a lot of fish in that sea of unaffiliated voters who are looking for good answers, looking for people who are going to do more than just say, I'm going to cut taxes, but really want to know, now, how are you going to lead the state? How are you going to act when a big snowstorm hits? What's going to happen if you got to do something with the federal government that's unexpected? And what are you going to do about rising seas in towns like Madison? These are all things that I think people really want to know about their governor. And some of them are public radio listeners, and some of them listen to WTIC, and some of them read Breitbart, and they're all out there looking for information.
Neil Victor.
I think that the Stefanowski campaign, that they, there is a trepidation about, perhaps a gaffe or, being asked about, which agency are you going to cut or which program are you going to cut, and being pressed on, Bob has talked about moving to zero-based budgeting, which he would bring from his corporate background. And I think that the Stefanowski campaign had decided that that the message of tax cuts rather than the fine print is how they're going to roll, win or lose. And they're starting to see in this latest Sacred Heart and Hearst poll that the unaffiliateds are breaking for Stefanowski. and there are about 800,000 unaffiliated voters in the state, and that's more than Democrats who are in the 700,000, and certainly more than the 400,000 Republicans.
We're going to be talking more about, again, these promises made on the campaign trail from Bob Stefanowski with repealing the income tax and what he could realistically cut. Keith Faniff from the Connecticut Mirror will be joining us in just a few minutes. But I wanted to go back to the question of transparency. Again, he's running a campaign being very clever about who he's going to speak to, shutting out the press. And I'm wondering, within the Capitol Press Corps, Neil, are there concerns about if Bob Stefanowski is elected, what does that mean for transparency and access to the governor of the state of Connecticut?
Well, I know that some of my colleagues have certainly been frustrated with the kind of access and the kind of cat and mouse game about, well, where's Bob? And I had talked to Rich Hanley, the media professor at Quinnipiac, for my story that ran over the weekend, and he makes a point that dealing with the media in a campaign is really training for when you're governor and when there's a crisis and having to answer for it. So certainly there are people that have that sentiment.
Neil, Victor. Go ahead, John.
I'm sorry, Lucy, very quickly, I just wanted to say, and that's why I mentioned that this part of the job that includes, putting on the hat and the bomber jacket when there's a big snowstorm, the thing that Governor Malloy had to do several times in his first year on the job. You don't really prepare for that sort of thing, and you're there with a bunch of pesky reporters who are up in their pajamas asking tough questions at 6 o'clock in the morning about how we're going to open up the roads, and those are the sorts of things that governors have to do too. And so whoever wins this race, they're going to have to be prepared to do that part of the job and not just figure out how we're going to balance the budget, how we're going to balance the tax structure in the state. Those are the real things people have to do too when they take on that job.
John Dankosky is host of WNPR's The Wheelhouse, also executive editor of the New England News Collaborative. John, thanks for calling in.
Thanks so much, Lucy.
Also, Neil Victor, political reporter at the Hartford Courant. Neil, thank you.
Great to be with you, Lucy. Have a good day.
You too. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we're going to focus in on Bob Stefanowski's promise to repeal the state income tax. And if elected, realistically, where could he cut spending? Keith Faniff will join us to talk more about the state budget. And we want to hear from you, too. Which gubernatorial candidate are you leaning towards November 6th? Join us at 860-275-7266. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. So what do Connecticut voters know about GOP candidate Bob Stefanowski? He's a businessman. He spent almost a decade living and working abroad. He didn't vote for 16 years, and he wants to repeal Connecticut's income tax. Is that enough information for voters when they cast their ballot on Election Day? We were hoping to learn more about Bob Stefanowski by sitting down with him for a long-form interview, as we've done with other gubernatorial candidates, but he canceled his appearance on our show today. So instead, we're spending time on the campaign points Stefanowski has addressed, mostly in debates and the occasional press interview. And you can join our conversation, too. The number 860-275-7266. What kinds of answers are you looking for from Stefanowski and other governor candidates? We want to hear from you again. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Now, joining us now is Keith Faniff, who follows the Capitol closely for the Connecticut Mirror and knows more about the budget than, dare I say, some legislators. Keith, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So we've been hearing Bob Stefanowski talking a lot about this idea to repeal the income tax over 8 years. There haven't been a lot of interviews where he sat down, broadcast interviews where he sat down and talked about different issues in that long form format. But I did want to mention that he was on Face the State with Dennis House just a couple of weeks ago, and this is what he told Dennis House about his income tax proposal.
In the 25 years before we had that income tax, Connecticut was the fastest growing state in the entire country. In the 25 years since, we're the only state that hasn't recovered the jobs from the Great Recession. We have a horrible economy, so it shows the power of tax policy. I would say number two, it's an 8-year plan. We've got no tax cuts in the first 2 years. We're going to gradually phase it in as we can afford to do it.
So we heard Bob Stefanowski, again, talking about that income tax proposal. This is something your colleague, Mark Pasniokis, also reported on the other day. So again, realistically, when we hear about Bob making the point that before the income tax, Connecticut was prospering, this is before 1991, but there were other ways that the state was getting needed revenue. How was it?
That's the part that it shows that Bob is perhaps not as familiar with Connecticut history as maybe he needs to be. Connecticut has been taxing income, wait for it now, for the better part of almost 50 years. For people who are now doing math going, wait, 1991 to now. Here's the problem. Starting in 1970, Connecticut had a tax on income. It was specifically capital gains. In 1972, we added a tax on dividends and interest. Now, granted, if you don't remember paying it and you're like me, you're 54, well, I didn't pay it at the time because I was in kindergarten and then elementary school. But for the seniors out there who say, well, it was primarily a tax on the wealthy. You had to make a considerable amount of capital gains or dividends to pay that tax. But that tax was how Connecticut built up its surpluses in those exact same times that Bob is saying, oh, we seem to do so well in the 70s and the 80s. In the mid-1980s, the capital gains and dividends tax paid for almost 12% of the budget. The sales tax doesn't boom. It doesn't shrink. It's relatively flat. So during that period of time, not only did we have an income tax, not only did we have an income tax in the wealthy, but we taxed them at higher rates than we do today.
And so when we hear that this income tax repeal from Bob Stefanowski, if elected, would be over 8 years, he's also mentioned again that this wouldn't be immediate, that he would try to cut spending after 2 years. So where realistically could the state of Connecticut cut when we talk about the pension liabilities that haven't been paid all this time?
That's the other problem. Bob is trying to take this business approach. He's saying, look, I'm going to begin with zero-based budgeting. I call it white-knuckle fiscal sobriety. I'm just going to refuse to give departments more, and that will be enough. It'll be enough until a federal judge comes in and says, Connecticut, pay your bills. We have huge segments of our budget that are largely locked in by contract. We can bluster, we can talk about it, but we have to pay these bills. We have right now 4 line items, just 4 line items in the budget, okay? Retirement benefits, we're talking about pension contributions for teachers, pension contributions for state employees, retirement benefits for state employees, retirement health care, Again, I'm not talking about health care for people on the job today, just for retirees. Those 3 retirement benefits and debt service, the payments on the money we borrow to build schools, projects at UConn, fix state buildings. Those 4 line items, which were maybe not even 10% of the budget when we passed the income tax that we all know in 1991, they're almost 1/3 of the budget today. 1/3 of the budget just goes for that. And we haven't hired a state employee yet. We haven't had a Medicaid program established yet. And we're building our budget from zero up. 1/3 of it's out the door, and we're still in the contractual area. Then you factor in salaries and benefits, Medicaid, and by the way, we're talking $2.5 billion that you can't just turn around and stop without the federal government's permission. Now all of a sudden, you're over 60% of the budget. That's locked in. And here's what's left. It's the areas that Bob and most of the candidates say they don't want to touch. And even if they said they did, good luck dealing with the legislature. You're talking about municipal aid. You're talking about the block grants to colleges and universities, public colleges and universities, by the way. The community colleges and the state universities, tuition's already about 25%, tuition and fees 25% higher than it was 8 years ago. UConn, 35% higher. And then you're talking about social services specifically that are not Medicaid reimbursed. We're talking about the programs where the state says, even though the federal government doesn't help us, we're going to step in. You're talking about needle exchange. You're talking about teen pregnancy prevention. Again, good luck chopping into that.
You're hearing Keith Phaneuf. He's a reporter for the Connecticut Mirror as we dive into some of the campaign promises GOP candidate Bob Stefanowski has delivered since before the primary, and now that he is in a statistical tie with Democrat Ned Lamont. You can join our conversation, 860-275-7266. Something else, Keith, that we have heard him say often just in that debate the other week was talking about zero-based budgeting. This is what Stefanowski mentioned.
Every department come in, we will exercise zero-based budgeting. We have a $40 billion biannual budget. Does anybody in the audience or anybody at home think I can't find 5 to 10% of waste, fraud, and abuse in the state of Connecticut government?
So when we hear, again, zero-based budgeting, so what's the biggest state agency that Connecticut funds? Is it Department of Social Services?
Department of Social Services is the largest. But I just want to mention, Lucy, because I've been following the waste, fraud, and abuse line throughout the campaign. Initially, Bob made it sound, he would say, I only need 5%. He was getting, I think, 1 and 2 year budgets confused. He was saying, well, over 2 years, it's a $40 billion budget. In 1 year, it's 20. So I'm sorry to start doing the math here quickly, but 5% of 40 is $2 billion. Well, that was the 1 year deficit. So first off, it's not 5%, it's 10. Here's the other problem. Because what's driving those deficits are these pension costs that are increasing and increasing. By the time you get to the last year of his term, if we didn't make adjustments from today's spending, you'd have a 17% deficit. It would be much larger than the $2 billion hole they're projecting now. There's not close to 17% of waste in the budget. And that's not to say that there aren't places that you still can't cut. But if you're looking at what is discretionary in large numbers, you're talking about municipal aid. And by the way, you could even argue how discretionary is that when 2/3 of that municipal aid deal is going into trying to equalize education in Connecticut.
I should mention with us in studio as well our political analyst, Dr. Bilal Sakou, Associate Professor of Political Science at Hilliard College at the University of Hartford. Bilal, welcome back to the show.
Good morning.
And Dr. Jonathan Wharton, Assistant Professor of Political Science and Urban Affairs at Southern Connecticut State University. Hi, Jonathan.
Good morning, Lucy.
You're also Political Director for Kurt Miller, the GOP candidate for State Comptroller, but you're just here to talk about the gubernatorial race.
Exactly.
So we're hearing Keith break it down for us of like what is realistic. This is what the state of Connecticut, the governor who's elected, will have to deal with. There's only so many places to cut. Yet Bob Stefanowski's message of repealing the income tax and cutting spending, going against and for finding where that waste and abuse and fraud is, that's appealing to voters. Why is this more factual account of what's realistic not making it to voters when they think about why they would like a Bob Stefanowski as governor? Jonathan?
Well, I guess I'm curious to even ask Keith this question too, because I hear this over and over again. His big argument in all this is that what about finding new pathways of broadening out our economy? Because obviously the state economy has a significant shortfall. And so his argument is that if there's a way to grow that base, and that would bring in more revenue. And I'm not just saying statewide, but even locally, especially when it comes to municipal aid, because obviously that is a big chunk of the budget too. So I'm curious about your element, your assessment as it relates to his growing out the economy.
Sure. That's, to me, one of the most common questions that's asked. I think it comes from the fact, and I'm not trying to, by any means, to put down or belittle the question. People know we owe a lot of money, but they don't know how much we owe. And when I say our pension debt is growing faster than the best segment of our general fund tax stream ever grew in boom years in the 90s and the 2000s. In other words, you could rev that economy up much better than it's doing right now. And by the mid-2020s, the bill collector will be at the door, snatch up every penny of it and say, what else do you have for me? That is how much more money Connecticut owes than almost any other state in the nation in terms of pension debt. And we will be paying on that for the next 15 years, to put it bluntly, until a particular generation of retirees who worked at a time when Connecticut was really irresponsible about saving, until that generation passes on. it's of course you want to grow. In a perfect world, you'd love to be able to keep your tax rate stable to get that economy going. The problem is the bill collector won't give you the time to do that. And until someone can show me case law or legal research that says I can just go before a federal judge and say the wealthiest state and the wealthiest nation in the world should not have to pay these obligations because otherwise our economy might decline, then I think you have to be realistic and say, what else is the plan to at least mitigate the problem? But you don't have the luxury of waiting to let your economy boom.
Bilal.
Listening to your assessment of the budget, I mean, which was very sobering. And I think it's one of the things that probably more people out there in the public needs to know about.
That's why they don't have me back more often.
Exactly. But it's one of those things, and I'm sort of listening and I'm thinking to myself, and Lucy alluded to this, I'm going, given how sobering that assessment was, why do people out there believe we can still do this? And so for me, I'm sort of wondering about your thoughts about what is that disconnect between the reality of what you actually can do with this budget, the limitations that we're faced with in terms of trying to, eliminate the income tax and make cuts without gutting the social safety net and dramatically reducing the public sector workforce, which would undermine the quality of services that people expect from the state. Why that disconnect out there, you think, between what the public believes is possible who are supporting Stefanowski versus the reality that you just laid out? If
you'll forgive me for answering your question with a question, I would put it to you because you gentlemen probably can answer this much better than I can. What are the odds of somebody getting elected with a message that's sobering? I've been very, I've shown a lot of light or tried to in the last few minutes on Bob Stefanowski's campaign, but I ran a story today about how Ned Lamont's really painted himself into a fiscal corner. Right. He has said, I'm not going to raise the income tax. I'm not going to raise the sales tax. I'm not even going to tap the rainy day fund, and I'm going to deliver all this tax relief while shielding municipal aid and higher education. There's nothing left. Because if you really think somebody could get elected saying, I can't give you a good root canal. We've done so much damage to our teeth. Hope we have a good dentist and a lot of Novocaine, but I cannot promise you a positive experience any more than I can promise you a good, fun fall out of a third-floor window. Connecticut is, I can say tuck and roll and try to not break your neck, but you're going to be in pain. Connecticut's done so much damage over the next 15 years, but the question is, who can get elected? Can I announce today Keith Fana for governor at notachanceandheck.com? That's what it comes down to. And I think people have said there's no chance of getting elected. Being candid, let's just all go with varying degrees of I'll be generous here and say positive spin.
We've heard Oz Griebel mention that if he's elected, again, he's below 10% of likely voters that would cast a ballot for him, he would want to use the rainy day fund. And this is something that Bob Stefanowski hasn't ruled out if he were elected for the first couple of years. Right.
And Oz has also even said, and I think this is highly legally questionable that he could do it. He wants to go to the unions and say, can we go back to raiding the pension funds for a couple of years? You talk about not a chance in heck. Labor's never going to give the green light to do it. I don't think the legislature would do that. That is the path that Connecticut took. And even though Oz has said, well, maybe there's some ways we can try to mitigate how much damage we do to the pension fund, I can't see anybody backing that path.
This is Where We Live. Keith Fana from the Connecticut Mirror is here. Also, Dr. Bilal Sidku from the University of Hartford and Dr. Jonathan Wharton from Southern Connecticut State University, both professors of political science. You can join us, too, at the number 860-275-7266. Christina's calling from New Britain. Christina, go ahead.
Hi, yes. I wanted to call because I was very troubled that Bob did not show up today. I'm an independent millennial voter in this state, really speaking to that base that you guys were talking about earlier. And I've been listening to all of your shows, and they really have been insightful and intriguing. I think that all of the candidates are a little troubling, including Ned Lamont. So that just goes to show that I am here for you to tell me like what you want to do for this state. I go to a public university in this state. I'm very concerned about how you feel about student budgets, and Bob missed a chance to tell me about that. And he also, comparing him to Trump is a little troubling too, because it's kind of what he wants. This idea of diminishing any voice that doesn't agree with you is not right. And I really think that residents in the state, especially millennial voters, please get out there, because the local stuff will affect you way more than any of the national hysteria that they get you to buy into. So I wanted to tell you that. And I appreciate what NPR does, getting visibility to all of the candidates, because I need to see them. We don't get to see all of you. So don't just go to the towns that you think you're going to capture. Try and capture me. I'm out here in New Britain. So.
Thank you, Christina, for your call and for listening. I wanted to go back to Jonathan Wharton. She made the point that often comparing him to Trump is problematic, and it's actually something that I think probably helps, really solidify his base. This is something that we've heard Democrat Ned Lamont often doing. Is that problematic for him, as he's now in a tie with Stefanowski?
Well, what Stefanowski said publicly, and even the party has kind of cemented as well, is to stress that, listen, when it comes to Donald Trump, there are concerns, there are problems, there are issues, and especially in terms of his messaging, but it's all about the economy. And that as president, he's found ways of broadening out the economy, especially the U.S. national economy. And so the emphasis that Stefanowski is stressing is that we can do the same thing here in Connecticut, taking some of the same policies and stressing the economic ones as opposed to the other issues. So I think that's what Stefanowski's relying on, to at least consider the basis, you said, Lucy, but also consider a lot of the independents and affiliated voters out there and recognize that it's the economy.
Yeah, but what's interesting to me, though, and this came out in the previous section of this talk, that there's this playbook that it seems that people are now turning to, and that playbook is to make promises you can't keep. Right? There was never going to be a 2,000-mile wall built across the southern border of the country, but it was something that resonated with the base. It was something that the base could rally around. You can talk about, getting rid of the income tax. There are a lot of people in Connecticut who hate taxes. What strikes me as particularly problematic about this moment, though, is that you would expect people to turn to the media to get that information that they need to really help clarify what the budget is, what are the possibilities, to hear tough questions be asked of the politicians. But there's also this recognition, and I think what Stefanowski recognizes, is that the media in Connecticut, like the media across the country, the public is suspicious of, especially among Republican voters. And so what that essentially means then is that he can sort of dodge the media, not show up for interviews, and it doesn't hurt him with the base because the base doesn't trust the media anyway. And I imagine that a lot of independents are probably in that camp as well in terms of not trusting the media, and this is part of the problem.
I wouldn't say all the media, though. I think that there's an interest out there among some Republicans that oftentimes there's a framing. There's at least a preference for not one side over another, but more lopsided, it appears, more liberal and centrist as opposed to more conservative libertarian perspective out there. And I think that's a bigger issue that we need to kind of get into. Obviously media literacy is critical, but assessing opinions versus, actual news information needs to be discerned. And often that's not out there.
But I think we're at that point where people have lost the ability to make that distinction.
I agree with you on that.
And what happens is that we treat any sobering assessment that Keith just gave to us as just an opinion of the Connecticut Mirror reporter rather than
an analysis,
an analysis of the state and the limitations we confront.
I think that's, first of all, very insightful, totally valid. And I think to add to that, the media is somewhat responsible, not solely, but also plays a role in that lack of trust because the media has lost so much institutional memory. It has deteriorated in a lot of ways like other organizations, other entities. It doesn't have the same level of experience, the same level of reporting expertise that it had a decade ago, 20 years ago. And you don't get as many sobering assessments because some news organizations lack the personnel to go deep into these topics. So you get this superficial he said, she said type reporting. Well, Jane Doe said that she can, solve all of our problems and give everybody golden cars. And her opponent, John Smith, says, I disagree. That's what passes for an investigation a lot of times. And it's not a surprise that some people are getting frustrated.
And the bottom line, ratings. You're also speaking, obviously, to a certain market. It works. Both sides.
But we're glad to have Keith Fannin from the Connecticut Mirror to give us that sobering analysis in the context of what Connecticut is facing over the next several years. Keith, thank you for coming on. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
This is Where We Live. We're going to take a quick break, and coming up, we're going to ask our political analysis again. What are some other issues that voters want to hear from the candidates before they cast their ballot? And we're going to talk with them, Bilal Sekou and Jonathan Wharton, right after the break. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. This programming note, Ned Lamont is coming on Where We Live tomorrow for our gubernatorial series where we're sitting down with candidates, asking them questions and taking your questions too, both on air and on Facebook Live. Don't miss that conversation tomorrow. Now, we've been focusing on GOP candidate Bob Stefanowski today. He did cancel his appearance on Where We Live, but as we've been talking, there's still plenty of questions that voters have about him and what he could do if elected governor of the state of Connecticut. Political analysts Bilal Sekou and Jonathan Wharton are with me in studio. I mentioned this earlier, but I want to circle back to it. What are some other issues that voters want to hear from the candidates? Again, as Keith mentioned, they don't want to hear all the doom and gloom about how we haven't been paying our liabilities, and there's no easy answer in front of us. Jonathan?
I think, number one, you see all the polls out there, all the universities put out there, it is the economy. That is probably the pressing issue out there. I'd say, number two, the cost of living here. Again, there is financially related, something that Stefanowski's certainly been speaking about. Beyond that, there's concerns still related about education, certainly, what's going on in that area, in that field, and what can we do as a state to bring more pride back? I'm curious about that. I mean, you hear about that, too. It seems like we've lost our mojo.
Bilal.
Yeah, those would actually be my top three issues as well. And so let me just sort of dig down around the issue of education, which is something that I care a great deal about. I think our state has some real challenges in front of it, not only in terms of equity and balance, in terms of spending in school, but also improving test scores and raising the quality of education across all of our cities in the state, getting rid of this huge gap we have between suburban and urban school systems, and also between whites and non-whites. And so I would love to hear our politicians talk a lot more about how they would accomplish that.
Carolyn's calling in from West Hartford. Carolyn, what do you want to hear from the candidates?
Well, I agree with the panel that, the issues of the economy, especially fiscal and transparency issues, are critical. But I have not heard any discussion about, among the candidates, especially for social or civil rights issues, and especially abortion rights and LGBTQ rights. So those are issues that I would like to have people address, and I'm particularly concerned about the lack of questions in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn, for your call. Going back to education, we were curious, again, if Bob Stefanowski had appeared on the show. We wanted to talk to him about how you fund public school education as well as higher ed. In the Hartford Current, it reported last month that Stefanowski said his plans for education include maintaining state grants to municipalities and encouraging students to explore the state's vocational and technical schools, but no mention of the community college system, which under Ojakian could see some drastic changes. And I'm just wondering, is that something that state residents that are employed and who go to community colleges are worried about?
I think in particular, as we try to reposition Connecticut as a place where job growth will occur, community colleges will play a critical role in helping that occur, because you've got people who will need to go back to school to be retrained or trained in new areas. Community colleges will play a very vital role in making that happen. And so I think, and this is a challenge across the nation, not just in Connecticut, but it is something that we absolutely need to be talking more about.
I think the critical issue right now we're faced with is we have over a dozen community colleges, and obviously that's something that the commission's dealing with right now at the state level. Do you find ways or pathways of cutting some of those out, merging them, making it all one institution? This is something obviously that Ojakian, as you said, is dealing with the Students First initiative. And then we obviously have 4 regional universities, including Southern. What do we do about that? Look, it's no secret. Enrollment has been dwindling. in the last couple of years. What do we do to buoy that up? Yeah. And that is a big issue. That is a big area that has to be addressed.
I mean, in general, the Northeast is challenged with, trying to increase enrollments because the number of kids who are graduating from high school in the Northeast is declining.
It is.
And so we've got to figure out ways to attract kids from other parts of the country to come into the Northeast to get an education. But I think you're absolutely right. And that's really one of the biggest challenges, that we're losing bodies, and we need them in our classrooms in order to give them the kind of education they need.
Absolutely. Lucy, if I can go back to even the callers and what the caller mentioned, I think when we're dealing the candidates, when it comes to social issues, it's not being touched, because that's largely an area that's almost a third rail to at least bring up her question and concern about that on both sides of the aisle, really.
I was talking to a Hispanic woman who told me that this slate of candidates is pretty bland, which makes me wonder, are Black and Hispanic voters going to turn up from the cities to vote for any of these gubernatorial candidates?
That's one thing I'm going to be paying attention to, because obviously urban demographics is something that I specialize in. I'm very interested in. I want to see how many people are going to show up from the urban areas.
Bilal, 30 seconds.
I think the strategy that Stefanowski has pursued, I think in part is a reflection of his belief that enthusiasm is not there for Ned Lamont. And so they've got a lot of work to do in the next week or two to turn out people to vote.
I'm happy to say both Bilal and Jonathan will be back tomorrow after we interview Democratic candidate Ned Lamont. So we'll hear your analysis of his campaign, and then we'll be continuing our conversation on Monday. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Scott Breedy. Thanks for listening.